We're going to be talking about the Etruscan culture today. And the Etruscan culture, I always really frame them as a bridge culture because they come between the Greeks and the Romans, and in a sense are the home culture of the Italian peninsula before the Romans arise. The Romans actually were the Latini, so if you're looking at this map, the idea that they speak Latin, right, and they're the Latini, you'll notice that Rome falls into those borders. So notice that while the Etrusci were living here, the Etruscans were living here, again, the early Romans were as well. What will happen is the Romans will, in a sense, absorb, right, Etruscan culture. So they're a bridge culture, I'd say, between the Greek experience and the Roman experience, but I'd also want to make sure you understand that the Romans eventually absorb, right, the Etruscan culture as well. And this overlay is important to understand because I think, we study the Romans and they don't talk quite as much, of course, about the Etruscans because why would you? They're a culture that basically you oust or you get rid of. But again, you'll notice that the end of the Etruscan reign comes with Tarquinius Superbus, who was ousted around 509 BC. And this starts the Republican Roman time period. So when we're talking about the Romans and start going through their time periods, you can think back to this date and this event. And how do the Romans frame, in a sense, getting rid of the Etruscans? They use mythology. So we've talked a lot about creation stories and their power. And in a sense, I always think of this as the Roman creation story for why the Etruscans had to go. In the mythology, there's the discussion of the family of Brutus and the rape of Lucretia. And the idea I always say is this idea that, the ruling family can't be trusted. If they have a son who rapes another highborn woman, how can these people be okay if they have family members who are doing these egregious acts? So the Romans, I think the way that they try to kind of frame this is that the Etruscans are no good, right? The Etruscans can't be trusted. But at the same time, we'll see the Etruscans don't really seem to have a lot of what we call nationalism. They're not really one to try to cling to their culture for patriotic reasons or nationalistic reasons. So when the Romans, in a sense, start to absorb them, they don't really seem to mind this happening to them also. So I think there's a kind of a combination of things that leads to the Etruscans dying out as a culture because they don't really seem to care. The Romans are like, well, hey, come join us. And again, their patriotism and their nationalism is rather low. So for them, it probably seems very easy, right, to join the Romans and their way of life. So again, just some things to keep in mind when thinking about the Etruscans. The Etruscans are pretty hard to study in a typical way because they, again, don't really value their own history in a lot of ways. And a lot of what we have written about the Etruscans is the Romans writing about them in the past. So it's not even the Etruscans, in a sense, talking about themselves. It's the Romans framing them. So they're very, very difficult to study. And a lot of what we have to do is see how they use either Greek culture as inspiration, as we'll talk about here with the temple, or how the Romans will start to absorb the Etruscans into their lives. So again, definitely this sort of bridge between the other two classical, right, groups, as we might say. The Greco-Romans, the Etruscans often get left out of that discussion. But again, it makes them very difficult for us to study, very difficult for us to really know on an intimate level. And when we look at a lot of their art, a lot of it's not around anymore. So you'll notice here we're looking at a temple reconstruction. The reason why, because Romans didn't really value keeping these temples intact, right, or in situ. They were going to build their own temples, so they really didn't care much about, preserving Etruscan architecture. Also, the Italian peninsula is a very earthquake-prone region. So there's a lot of shaking that goes on the Italian peninsula. So what we find even up to the present day is that a lot of architecture gets damaged or destroyed just over the natural course of existing in this region. So we don't have extant or existing Etruscan temples. So what archaeologists have to do is use the archaeological findings to try to reconstruct them. And they also use the Roman recollections, so the Romans talking about the format of these temples, to try to give us a sense of what you would see at a temple. What I always try to note is you can see the Greek influence very, very strongly, but then you'll note how they change it up. For instance, with a Greek temple, you would always have two entrances. You'd have a front porch and a back porch. The first thing to note right away is that there's only one porch. So they take away the idea of Greek symmetry and perfection in that type of design and simplify it down to one porch only. However, you'll notice there's three openings, or three cellas, or three interior temple spaces where the gods or goddesses could be worshipped. Now, if you go back and look at Greek temples, you'll note that they're only dedicated to one god. We looked primarily at the Parthenon. And that was the temple for Athena, and Athena only. So the Greeks were very specific about this. One temple, one god. And typically the idea, just like the Mesopotamians, that each city-state had a primary god. This changes under the Etruscans. They actually adopt a lot of the format of Greek religion or Greek polytheism. They just simply change the name of the gods. But for them, they actually pick a trinity of gods to honor in their temples. They pick Zeus, kind of the father god, right? Hera, his wife, like a mother god, right? And then the idea of Athena, or the daughter. So this idea of almost like a trinity, right? The father, mother, daughter. But again, if you think about, comparative religion, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, right? And a lot of other religions use trinities as well. So again, look at, Hinduism and the idea of Vishnu, Shiva, Durga, that kind of idea. So they picked three gods here to honor. For the Greeks, that would have been a big no-no. You couldn't have multiple gods hanging out in the same temple. So keep this in mind as far as a change in how Etruscans will use their temples, and we'll see even more changes when we get to the Romans, because the Romans basically copycat the Greek religion as well. I always joke that they're plagiarizers. They basically take the Greek gods and change their names. They cut and paste it, They're like, well, this already exists, we might as well take it. So again, these are some significant changes that you see. You'll also notice that the pediment area, the triangular area that we saw the sculpture at the Parthenon, that is empty, and the sculpture has actually moved to the rooftops here. So it's been freed from the pediment, right, as far as its location, which of course frees up what you can do with it. Remember, you had to sort of use unusual poses to deal with that triangular space. So you'll notice that the sculptures are put on the rooftop here. And we'll talk a little bit about the sculpture and its format, right, as well. So again, just looking at this model, we can see that there's a lot of Greek heritage here, sort of framing the conversation of architecture, but there's a huge amount of changes that have happened as well. And again, this is the plan of a typical Etruscan temple, so you'll note once more that there is only one porch, right, three cellas or three interior spaces for Zeus, Hera, Athena. As I mentioned, obviously they're going to be renamed into the Etruscan dialect, but the idea of having that trinity of gods becomes more important to them. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the type of sculpture that you would see on top of the rooftops, and this is a good example of one of those sculptures. It's a sculpture of Apollo, or in the Etruscan dialect, Apullu. Apollo is the sun god, kind of the god of the arts. We didn't touch on him in our Greek discussion, but he's a pretty important god in the Greek pantheon of the gods. And I wanted to mention that if you look at the sculpture, you'll note, again, a lot of similarities to like Greek and Egyptian art, but also some differences as well. So this sculpture, the way it looks, always reminds me of the Egyptian look or the archaic Greek look. The stance, the way the body is striding, obviously looks very Egyptian, and then the hairstyle, etc., that looks sort of more archaic Greek as well. But note that where the Greek sculptures were usually shown nude, Romans and Etruscans are going to go ahead and start clothing these statues. So you have, cloth, right, on the figure here. So they didn't do the whole body beautiful thing in the same way that the Greeks would have. You'll notice there's a bracing element between the legs that would have attached the sculpture to the rooftop. And then the material that's used here is actually terracotta. So the use of the terracotta is a different material that we haven't seen before. So we've seen the use of stone, we've seen the use of marble, we've seen bronze, right? And here we're seeing terracotta. Terra basically means earth. Cotta means clay in Italian. So terra, earth, cotta, clay. Basically clay of the earth. It's clay, that's what it is. If you go to a garden supply store and you buy a terracotta pot, then you know what I'm talking about. This is a very easy material to make. It's a very cheap material, but it's highly breakable. So why don't we have a lot of these rooftop sculptures anymore? Because a lot of them during earthquakes fell off the roof and broke. When the Romans came through and started to build their own temple, they could break these things really easily and just throw them away, pulverize them. So it's a highly breakable material, terracotta. But again, very different than the marble or the bronze that we see with the Greeks. So again, moving into kind of a different idea of materials and how to use them. I also want to tell you a little bit about burials amongst the Etruscans, because I think there's a lot of influence of the Egyptians here as well, with the necropoli, let's say. But the Etruscans, they use what we call tumulus mounds. And if you look at the picture here, you'll notice that you see these kind of conical or half circular shapes kind of dotting the landscape. These are the tumulus mounds, and they often were placed together, again, very similar to what we would talk about with the necropoli. Here's a good shot of one of them. So you'll notice there's sort of this, again, conical or half circular shape on the surface, and then the burial would be underneath the ground. So a little bit similar to the Egyptian mastaba idea of having a structure on the surface and then, basically having the tomb rooms, in a sense, carved out below. So you'd enter on the surface, and then the sort of rooms for the tomb were down below the surface. So again, we think about burial. This seems to have a very much Egyptian kind of influence, right, on what was going on as far as burial was concerned. And you go down into the rooms, and of course you'll see very interesting decorations, just like you'd see with the Egyptians. This is the tomb of the reliefs, because you'll notice it has a lot of relief carvings inside of it. And this is what we call the room of the tools. And just like with the Egyptians, we wonder if this was decorated in this fashion because the person worked with their hands, or this was their job during their life, or maybe they were kind of a hobbyist and they wanted to do more of that in their afterlife. Will we ever know for sure? Again, no, we can't. But notice that just like the Egyptians, they're going to decorate their spaces, and we wonder if that was a way for them to sort of celebrate the idea of what they would like to do in their afterlife. This is a wall painting from one of the tombs, the Tomb of the Leopards. So again, thinking about you going into your afterlife and wanting to have a pleasurable experience, here you have people drinking and eating and lounging on couches and such. So it seems to be a celebration of like, what would somebody want in their afterlife? To me, they've definitely seen the Egyptians and what they were doing, and then saw, what other cultures in the region had picked up from the Egyptians as well, and kind of just kept running with this idea. One important thing to note is how they actually buried people. So up until this point, bodily burial has been very important. The Egyptians sort of pilot that and make that the norm. With the Etruscans and then into the Roman culture, we actually start to see cremation. So the burning of the body and reducing it to ash, right? So they cremate. And this is a big shift that culturally happens regarding burial. This doesn't mean that you stop seeing things like sarcophagi, like you see here, but again, notice that two people are represented on the sarcophagus where it doesn't look like two people could fit. Well, the reason why they could fit is because they had been cremated, right? They had been reduced to ash, and then their ashes could be placed right inside the sarcophagus itself. The wedding sarcophagus, we often, again, point to the fact that there's a very archaic Greek or Egyptian look to the figures. And we also talk about terracotta as the primary material. So some of the things we've already touched on, again, you can see those influences here once more. And I always like showing you these because they're called cinerary urns. And incinerate is what you do to a body to cremate it. So why are they called cinerary urns? The word incinerate is linked to the idea of a cinerary urn. And I want to show you these because they're a much more simple way that most people were interred. Most people probably did not have that fancy sarcophagus that you just saw. That was probably something for higher status people. So we'd assume the wedding sarcophagus couple was higher status. Most people probably had a small urn like this. The one on the left particularly amuses me because it looks like a tumulus mound. So it's mimicking the larger scale burial structure in its form. And of course, I find that sort of humorous and comical. But again, this is the primary way that people are going to be buried now, is to be incinerated, to be cremated, rather than bodily buried. This will become a point of tension between the Romans and the Christians. So when we get there, I'll talk a little bit more about the issue of bodily burial between the Romans and the Christians, and how as the Christians emerge at the end of Roman culture, it's a struggle that they have with the Roman officials.